When we imagine the gladiators of ancient Rome, our minds are drawn to noise, to the roar of thousands of voices echoing beneath the marble arches of the Colosseum, to the clash of steel, the pound of feet, and the cries of those who fought beneath the hot Mediterranean sun. Yet behind that thunder lay a quieter, slower story, one that was not written in the sudden strike of the sword, but in the careful preparation of hands that worked in silence. This is not a story of the fighting itself. It is a story of the craftsmen, the workers, and the overlooked rituals that made each contest possible. Without them, there would be no gleam of armour, no neatly smoothed sand, no physicians standing by with bandages and salves. Their world existed in the shadows of the amphitheatre, before and after the noise, where life moved at a slower rhythm. Tonight, let us step away from the roar of the crowd. Let us walk through the hushed corridors of the amphitheatre in the early morning, when the sky above Rome is still pale with dawn and the arena lies empty. The marble steps are cool and silent. The gates stand closed. There is no shouting, no music, no clashing of weapons, only the footsteps of those who prepare. The air is heavy with dust, oil, and faint traces of iron. First, we meet the armourers. Their small workshops, often tucked away beneath the seats of the amphitheatre, were filled with tools and sparks. The armour of a gladiator was not the finely polished steel of a soldier, but heavier, designed to impress the eye of the audience. Helmets were crested and ridged, sometimes with wide visors that offered little vision, but plenty of spectacle. A Mumio's helmet with its broad brim, a Threx's curved blade, or the net and trident of the Retiarius. Each piece required attention, repair, and care after every fight. Listen closely and you might hear the rhythmic rasp of a file against iron, smoothing the dents from yesterday's contest. The clink of hammer against metal, shaping a new edge. The soft scrape of cloth dipped in oil, restoring the shine that the audience expected. These men worked slowly, patiently, sometimes repurposing older pieces, sometimes patching broken ones with whatever they had. Every rivet mattered. Every strap had to hold fast, for the difference between life and death could lie in the strength of a single buckle. Nearby, the physicians prepared their tools as well. Known as medici, they were not surgeons in the modern sense, but men of herbal knowledge, ointments, and stitching. They mixed powders of ground herbs, readied salves of honey and vinegar, and boiled cloths to cleanse wounds. To them, the body of a gladiator was both fragile and resilient. Bones that broke could sometimes mend, skin could be sewn, and blood could be staunched, but not always. Their presence was as much ritual as necessity. Before the crowd, the emperor and the gods, no fight could begin without healers waiting in the wings, silent and unseen, holding bowls of water, clamps and bandages. Then there were the sand layers, the most invisible of all. The arena floor was not bare earth, but carefully prepared sand chosen for its grain and colour. Fine, pale sand was often imported from distant quarries, spread evenly to catch the blood and offer firm footing. Each morning, men with rakes and baskets stepped into the empty amphitheatre, levelling the surface, smoothing the patches left by yesterday's struggle. Some carried water to sprinkle lightly, keeping the dust from rising into the air when the day grew hot. Theirs was not glamorous work, but it was essential. For the gladiators, the sand was their stage, and like actors upon a theatre floor, it needed to be ready. And so, hour by hour, in the stillness before the games, the amphitheatre came alive with quiet labour. A broken strap replaced here, a dent hammered out there, sand raked smooth in long, patient strokes, herbs ground into powder, stored in clay jars with careful lids. These were the sounds and scents of preparation. Imagine yourself moving slowly through this world. You pause to watch a smith polish the curve of a shield until it catches the light of a torch. You notice the faint smell of leather drying on a rack, straps cut and stitched with bone needles. You hear the sweep of a rake across sand, the grains shifting softly like a tide against the shore. You walk past shelves where helmets gleam in the dimness, their empty eye slits waiting for the men who will wear them. It is a world of anticipation, not of climax. A world where everything is done with care, knowing that once the gates open and the trumpets sound, there will be no room for hesitation. The quiet work of many hands becomes the foundation of a single hour of spectacle, and yet most of these workers remained anonymous. Their names were not recorded in marble inscriptions. Their faces were not remembered in paintings or mosaics. They were shadows moving in the background, leaving behind only traces, the worn tools of a smith, the hardened salves of a healer, the faint impressions of a rake upon ancient sand. As the sun rises higher, the amphitheatre slowly awakens. Vendors begin to arrive with baskets of food for the crowd. Guards take their positions at the gates. The armourers set aside their tools. The physicians close their jars. The sandlayers rest their rakes. The quiet hours fade, replaced by the swelling noise of people streaming in, eager for blood and contest. But tonight, as we drift into this story, we will remain in those earlier hours, in the hum of preparation, in the smell of oil and iron, in the silence of sand before it is disturbed. The world of gladiators was not only one of combat, it was also one of craftsmanship, labour and care. And it is there, in the shadows of the arena, that we begin our journey. When we think of the amphitheatre, we imagine warriors clashing under the open sky. But before those moments, there was a slower sound, the soft strike of a hammer, the whisper of a whetstone, the patient breath of men at work in the forge. The armourers of Rome, though nameless in most records, shaped the very tools of survival for those who entered the arena. Their workshops were often tucked beneath the stands of the amphitheatre, or set in small courtyards nearby. By dawn, these spaces glowed faintly with the red warmth of coals, though their fires were modest compared to the roaring furnaces of the great city smiths. Here the goal was not perfection, but readiness. Every day brought dents, cracks and wear from combat. Shields split along the grain, helmets bore deep gouges, swords chipped against bone and armour. The armourer's task was never finished, for iron was as mortal as the men who wore it. Imagine stepping into such a space. The air is thick with smoke and the sharp tang of iron filings. Leather straps hang drying from hooks along the walls. Against a bench lies a half-polished Murmillo helmet, its wide brim designed to shield the face but also to dazzle the crowd with its shine. Beside it rests the curved blade of a thrakes, still rough along its edge, waiting for the whetstone's slow caress. The men at work here moved with deliberate rhythm. The hammer strikes were not hurried, but measured, each blow followed by a pause, as if the smith listened for the metal's reply. Sparks flickered, then died into the dimness. One armourer bent over a small anvil, reshaping a dented greave, while another oiled a leather strap, softening it with fat so it would not crack under strain. It was said that gladiator armour was not designed for comfort, nor even for fairness, but for spectacle. The heavy helmets limited vision, the ornate crests added weight, and the shields were often larger or smaller than practical. Yet this was deliberate. The crowd wanted variety, not uniformity, and so the armourer became an artist of illusion, crafting tools that dazzled the eye but tested the strength of the men who bore them. Some of the weapons were blunted, others sharp. In certain staged fights, gladiators wielded wooden swords or dulled steel, their movements more performance than danger. In others, the edge was real, and every chip or flaw could mean the end of a man's life. The armourer, though unseen, played his part in that balance between drama and death. Let us linger here, in the calm of their labour. Imagine running your hand along the cool rim of a helmet, feeling the slight unevenness where a hammer once struck. Smell the oil that seeps into the leather, mixed with sweat from battles past. Hear the soft rasp of a file, smoothing a sword's jagged bite. The forge is not a place of violence, but of preparation. It hums with quiet purpose. In some corners, apprentices worked, boys or freedmen learning the craft, fetching water to cool the metal, carrying wood to keep the coals alive. They learned patience first, for rushing brought cracks, and cracks could not be hidden. In this way, the knowledge of armour passed from hand to hand, generation to generation, though few names survived the centuries. Occasionally, a gladiator himself would visit the workshop. He might stand silently, watching his helmet being repaired, or test the grip of his sword once it had been rebound with leather. There was little conversation. These men were not masters here, but dependents, reliant on the steady hands of others. Perhaps an armourer offered a nod, a murmured reassurance that the strap would hold, the edge would cut. Then the gladiator would leave, carrying with him both fear and faith in the invisible craftsman who had shaped his tools. By evening the forge quieted. Tools were set aside, fires dimmed to embers, and the smell of smoke gave way to the cooler scents of night. The armourers' work rarely drew applause, yet their silence was essential. Without them, there could be no gleaming spectacle for the crowd, no clash of arms beneath the sun. They were the unseen sculptors of survival, hammering and filing in rhythms that echoed through the very heart of Rome's entertainment. And as the city slept, the helmets, shields, and blades they crafted lay waiting in shadow, ready for the dawn. When the gladiators stepped into the arena, the crowd saw only the combat. Their eyes were fixed upon the gleam of helmets, the curve of blades, and the sudden bloom of blood upon pale sand. Yet they rarely wondered about the sand itself, where it came from, why it was so even beneath the fighters' feet, or who had carried it in basket after basket, grain by grain. The floor of the amphitheatre did not prepare itself. It was tended by quiet hands in the still hours before and after the contest in labour that was as vital as it was invisible. The Romans called this surface arena, a word that gave the arena its very name. It was not ordinary earth, but a deliberate choice, sand chosen for its softness, its absorbency, and its colour. In Rome itself, pale yellow sand was preferred, sometimes brought from distant riverbeds or quarries. In wealthier cities, exotic sands were imported, red from Libya, black volcanic ash from Vesuvius, or dazzling white grains from quarries near the coast. Each amphitheatre had its own character, its own ritual of preparation, and at the heart of it were the sand layers. Let us imagine the Colosseum before dawn. The sky is still dim, a faint wash of grey over the arches. Inside, the vast stands are empty, echoing with silence. At ground level, the great gates remain closed, and the arena floor lies waiting, scarred from yesterday's games. Here and there, dark patches stain the sand, reminders of wounds and endings that played out under the eyes of thousands. The surface is uneven, kicked into ridges and depressions by heavy footsteps and dragging shields. Into this quiet space come the workers. They are men of low station, slaves, freedmen, labourers hired for the day. Their tools are simple: wooden rakes, flat shovels, wicker baskets, and clay jars filled with water. They walk barefoot across the sand, their movements slow, deliberate, and unhurried. Theirs is not a performance but a ritual of restoration. They begin by smoothing the surface. With rakes they drag long, steady lines across the arena floor, evening out the ridges, pulling away debris left from combat, splinters of broken weapons, straps torn from shields, fragments of bone or tooth scattered in the struggle. Each stroke of the rake whispers across the grains, the sound soft and repetitive, like the sigh of wind through reeds. They work in rhythm, side by side, the lines of their rakes overlapping like waves folding upon a shore. Where the sand is too thin, they pour fresh baskets. The grains spill in quiet streams, falling like hourglasses turned over, restoring what was lost to dust, sweat, and blood. Sometimes the sand was mixed with crushed shells, sometimes with powders meant to absorb moisture more quickly. Always it was laid with care, never haphazard. For the gladiators who would fight, the footing mattered as much as the blade in their hand. A stumble upon loose ground could end a man's life before the fight had even begun. Once the floor was level, they turned to cleansing. Water was sprinkled from clay jars, the droplets darkening the pale surface, binding the grains together so they would not rise in choking clouds when the heat of day arrived. In some places, vinegar was mixed with the water, a sharp scent filling the air, thought to purify the ground and mask the odours of blood. The workers moved slowly, dipping ladles and flicking arcs of liquid across the sand, then raking again to spread the dampness evenly. And then, at last, there was the work of concealment. The Romans were not squeamish about blood, but even they preferred not to see yesterday's stains upon today's stage. In places where the sand was darkest, where life had seeped deep into the grains, workers simply poured fresh sand in thick layers, covering the past with a clean surface. In this way, every morning became a kind of erasure. What had happened the day before was buried, hidden beneath the weight of new grains, as though the arena itself began anew. Pause for a moment and notice the silence. There is no cheering crowd, no metallic clash of weapons, only the soft scrape of rakes, the hush of sand spilling from baskets, the faint splash of water against earth. The workers do not hurry. They know their task must be thorough, not rushed. The amphitheatre was the grandest stage of Rome, and the stage must always be ready. For those who laboured here, the games were both distant and near. They did not fight, but they touched the floor where men bled. Their rakes passed over the marks of swords, their feet pressed into the same earth where lives had ended hours before. Perhaps they grew accustomed to it. Perhaps they thought little of it, seeing only work to be done. Or perhaps, in quiet moments, they wondered what it was to stand armed in that circle, with thousands watching. Once the surface was prepared, they stepped back, leaving the arena pristine once more. To the audience who arrived later, the sand would seem untouched, as though no battle had ever been fought. But beneath the top layer lay memories. The grains held echoes of countless contests, each day buried under the next, like the layers of history itself. The sand layers did not receive applause. No poet praised their patience, no inscription bore their names. Yet without them, the games could not proceed. They were the silent custodians of the stage, shaping not the drama itself, but the ground upon which it unfolded. Their rakes and baskets formed a rhythm as essential as the trumpets and drums that announced the start of the games. And so, when the crowd roared and the gladiators stepped forth, they walked upon a floor that had been tended with care, levelled with patience, and cleansed of yesterday's scars. To the thousands who watched, it seemed as though the sand was eternal, always ready, always waiting. But the truth was different. It was the quiet labour of men in the shadows, performed each morning in silence, that gave the arena its timeless face. The amphitheatre is often remembered as a place of endings. It was where contests reached their peak, where weapons struck true, and where the crowd's voices decided whether a man would live or die. Yet woven into this world of endings was also a quieter thread of preservation. For every sword raised in violence, there was a pair of hands ready to bind wounds, cleanse blood, and coax life back into broken bodies. These were the Medici, the physicians of the games. They were not heroes of the arena, nor were they poets or philosophers. Their craft was practical, their presence expected but rarely honoured, and yet without them, the games could not continue. For what emperor would risk losing his gladiators to infection after a simple wound? What lanista, the owner of a gladiator school, would throw away the investment of years of training because a broken bone went untended? Survival, at least for some, depended on these healers. Let us step back into the hours before the games. The crowd has not yet arrived. The sand is raked, the armour polished, the gates locked in silence. Somewhere beneath the amphitheatre, in a small chamber cool and shadowed, the physicians prepare their tools. Clay jars line the shelves, each filled with powders and herbs, ground myrrh to cleanse wounds, honey to keep infection at bay, vinegar for washing cuts, and opium poppy to dull the edge of pain. Their instruments are simple: bronze scalpels with thin edges, hooks to probe and lift, bone saws for the most dire cases. Linen strips lie folded neatly in baskets, ready to bind a gash or splinter limb. Bowls of clean water stand at hand, though cleanliness was not yet understood in the way we know it now. Still, there was care in their rituals, a rhythm to their preparation. Every bandage folded, every salve mixed, every tool sharpened became part of a quiet choreography that unfolded before the noise of the day. The Medici were men of varied skill. Some had studied the writings of Hippocrates and Galen, learning theories of humours and balance. Others were practical healers, men who had stitched wounds on battlefields, midwives turned surgeons, or slaves trained by necessity. Their knowledge was imperfect, yet it was born of long observation. They knew how to set a dislocated shoulder, how to stop bleeding with pressure and ash, how to stitch flesh with catgut thread. They could not always save a man, but they could give him a chance. Imagine them waiting at the edge of the arena as the games begin. They do not cheer when the crowd erupts, nor do they watch for victory. Their eyes are fixed instead on the bodies that fall. At the signal of the editor, the sponsor of the games, they hurry forward, carrying their baskets of bandages and salves. The sand crunches beneath their sandals as they kneel beside a man, pressing cloth against a wound, washing blood with vinegar, whispering calm words as the roar of thousands swells around them. Sometimes the work was quick, a shallow cut cleaned, a bandage wrapped tight, the gladiator rising again to continue. At other times, it was desperate. A crushed limb, a pierced lung, a man gasping for breath as his blood darkened the sand. In those moments, the physicians worked swiftly, but they knew their limits. Death often came too fast and no hand could hold it back. Yet even then their presence offered a kind of dignity. A man did not die entirely alone. Someone bent over him, trying. Between matches they returned to their chambers, hands stained, sleeves damp with blood and vinegar. They prepared again, replacing bandages, grinding new herbs, whispering to themselves the prayers and incantations that accompanied their craft. Theirs was a cycle without applause. Prepare, treat, cleanse, repeat. For the gladiators, the physicians were paradoxical figures. They represented both fear and hope. To see them approach during a fight was to know that something had gone wrong. Yet to feel their hands binding a wound, to taste the bitter draught of a poppy mixture dulling the pain, was to feel the fragile thread of life being held, if only for a little longer. Consider the stillness of their chamber after the crowd has left. Outside, Rome celebrates its spectacles. Inside, the physicians wash their tools in bowls of cloudy water. The smell of herbs lingers, myrrh, vinegar, honey, mingling with the metallic tang of iron. Shelves are emptied and then refilled, for tomorrow will bring new contests, new wounds, new bodies carried in from the sand. The work of the Medici did not end with the games. At the gladiator schools, in the barracks where men lived day after day, physicians continued their craft. They stitched practice injuries, reset bones broken in training, applied poultices to swollen joints. They saw gladiators not only as combatants but as patients, men whose survival ensured that the games could go on. And so, when we picture the arena, let us pause not only at the clash of steel, but also in the quiet moments after. The physician bending over a wounded man, torchlight flickering on bronze tools, the murmur of instructions to assistants carrying water. Their presence was as constant as the crowd, though history rarely remembers their names. The amphitheatre was a place of endings, yes, but it was also a place where hands tried, however imperfectly, to hold life together, if only for another day. Beneath the amphitheatre, far below the tiers of marble and the sweep of the arena floor, lay a different world. It was a world without sunlight, where the air was damp and heavy, and where the sounds that echoed were not of men, but of animals. Snorts, growls, the restless scrape of claw against wood. Here, in these dim corridors and cages, lived the keepers of beasts. They were men whose names have been forgotten, though their work was essential to the spectacle above. To the crowd, the venations, the staged hunts, were moments of wonder. Exotic animals, drawn from the farthest reaches of the empire, were released onto the sand. Lions from North Africa, leopards from Asia Minor, elephants from India, crocodiles from the Nile, even bears from the cold forests of Germania. To see such creatures gathered in one place was to feel the power of Rome, the empire that could command nature itself. But behind this spectacle lay years of quiet toil, journeys across land and sea, and daily labours performed in shadows. The animals did not arrive in Rome as if by magic. They were captured in distant provinces, herded into ships, transported in chains, and brought at last to the underground chambers of the amphitheatre. By the time they reached the keepers, they were weary, half-starved, often sick. It was the task of these men to keep them alive until the day of their display. Picture the underground passageways of the Colosseum. Narrow corridors stretch into darkness lined with wooden cages. The smell here is sharp, straw mixed with dung, damp earth, and the musky scent of wild fur. The air is punctuated by sound. The low rumble of a lion shifting in its cage, the restless stamp of a bull, the hiss of a caged panther whose golden eyes flash in the torchlight. The keepers move carefully among them, carrying buckets of water, bundles of straw, or cuts of meat. Their clothes are rough, stained with sweat and dust, and their movements are deliberate, for one careless step could mean sudden death. They feed the animals through the bars, listening to the snap of jaws or the crunch of teeth on bone. They lay down fresh straw, replace broken planks, and check the ropes and pulleys that will one day haul these cages upward into the arena. There is no grandeur in this work. It is dangerous, filthy, and exhausting. And yet, it is performed with the same quiet patience that fills every corner of the amphitheatre's preparation. The keepers know their role. They are not tamers, not performers, but guardians of life until life is demanded above. Some animals are restless, pacing their cages endlessly. Others lie still, conserving strength, their eyes dull with resignation. The keepers observe them silently. noting which ones weaken, which ones fight against their bonds, which ones may not survive until the day of the games. They are both caretakers and wardens, bound to their charges by necessity, not affection. On the mornings of great spectacles, their work grows urgent. At dawn, they rise to check the mechanisms of the lifts, the great wooden platforms that will carry cages upward through trapdoors to the arena floor. The ropes are inspected, the pulleys greased, the levers tested. A misstep could be catastrophic, for the weight of an elephant or a bull was immense, and a failed lift could ruin the carefully staged illusion above. When the time comes, they drive the animals into position. The corridors ring with shouts and the crack of whips. A lion snarls as its cage is prodded forward. A bear resists, tugging at its chains. The keepers press forward steadily, guiding each beast to the wooden lift. Then, with groans of effort and the creak of ropes, a platform begins to rise, carrying the cage upward, out of the darkness into the blinding light of the arena. For the crowd above, it seems as though the earth itself has opened, releasing nature's fury into the sand. The roar of a lion or the trumpeting of an elephant is a moment of awe, a spectacle to be savoured. But for the keepers below, it is the end of a long vigil. They remain in the shadows, listening as the sounds of the animals mix with the cheers of the crowd, knowing their work will be hidden, unremembered, and when the spectacle is over, their labour begins anew. The bodies of fallen beasts are dragged back below, skinned, butchered, or left to rot. The cages must be cleaned, the straw replaced, the corridors scrubbed for the next day. Sometimes new animals arrive, weary from travel, needing food and water before they too are thrust into the cycle. The keepers move without complaint, for there is no end to the demands of the arena. In the stillness of night, after the torches are extinguished, the underground chambers return to quiet. A lion breathes softly in its sleep. A keeper leans against a wall, weary but awake, listening for the restless sounds that might signal danger. Above, the city of Rome sleeps beneath its stars, but below, in the shadowed heart of the amphitheatre, life stirs in cages, waiting. The keepers of beasts are seldom remembered. Their names do not appear in history, their work unpraised in poems. Yet without them, the Empire's grand illusions could not exist. They were the silent bridge between Rome and the wild, men who lived in darkness so that the crowd could marvel in light. And so, as we think of the amphitheatre, let us not only hear the roar of the crowd, but also the quieter sounds beneath. The creak of a wooden cage sliding forward, the soft rustle of straw being laid, the steady footfalls of men carrying water through shadowed halls. These too are the rhythm of Rome's spectacles. They are the music of the keepers, the forgotten guardians of the beasts. The gladiatorial games are often remembered as a thunderous chorus of noise, the cries of fighters, the roar of crowds, the trumpets announcing the emperor's arrival. Yet beneath this sound lay a gentler rhythm, a quiet orchestra of labourers who kept the spectacle alive. Their roles were many, their tasks varied, but together they formed a harmony of unseen work that filled every corner of the amphitheatre. Long before the crowd entered, cleaners walked the tiers of marble, sweeping away dust and leaves blown in by the wind. They carried baskets to collect scraps left from the previous day, fruit peels, broken cups, torn pieces of cloth. Their work was unremarkable, yet essential, for no emperor would wish his guests to sit among refuse. The bristles of their brooms whispered across stone, the soft shuffle of their sandals echoed through empty corridors. In these early hours, the amphitheatre belonged not to gladiators, but to these quiet custodians. As dawn brightened into day, vendors began to arrive, balancing baskets and jugs. They carried olives steeped in brine, roasted nuts, honey cakes wrapped in fig leaves, and jars of cheap wine diluted with water. Their voices would later sing through the crowds, calling softly from tier to tier, but for now they moved quietly, arranging their wares in shaded alcoves. The smell of bread, sweet and yeasty, drifted faintly through the air, mingling with the sharper scents of vinegar and smoke. Elsewhere, musicians gathered their instruments. Trumpeters polished long bronze horns, their surfaces gleaming in the morning light. Flutists checked the reeds of their pipes, adjusting the delicate balance of sound. These were not performers in the modern sense, but heralds, their music woven into the fabric of the games. A bright note to announce the emperor's arrival, a deep blast to signal the opening of the gates, a steady rhythm to accompany parades of gladiators across the sand. Their notes carried meaning, guiding the crowd's attention, marking the invisible structure of the spectacle. In the shadowed corridors, gatekeepers checked the locks and hinges of the heavy doors. The gates of the amphitheatre were more than wood and iron. They were barriers between life and death. With a turn of a key or the pull of a lever, a gladiator was released into combat, or a beast was loosed into the sand. The men who held these keys worked without applause, yet their timing determined the flow of every contest. Too soon, and the illusion was broken. Too late, and the rhythm faltered. Their work demanded silence and precision. Beneath the arena floor, stagehands tended to the machinery. The Colosseum was a marvel of engineering, with lifts, pulleys, and trapdoors that allowed cages of animals, scenery, or even entire sets to rise from below. These mechanisms were powered not by magic, but by the labour of dozens of men working in synchronisation. Imagine them straining against thick ropes, pulling in unison as a platform creaked upward. Their bodies glistened with sweat in the torchlight, yet above, the crowd saw only the wonder of a lion suddenly appearing as if from the earth itself. The stagehands remained hidden, their effort invisible, their breath steady as they prepared for the next cue. And then, at last, there were the announcers, the preco, men who raised their voices to the crowd, introducing fighters, declaring victories, and explaining decisions. They stood at the edge of the arena, scrolls in hand, their words carried by the amphitheatre's natural acoustics. Their voices were firm but not hurried, rising and falling like the tide, giving shape to the chaos of combat. They were part of the orchestra too, setting the rhythm of anticipation and release. Together, these many figures, cleaners, vendors, musicians, gatekeepers, stagehands, and heralds, formed a silent orchestra. Their movements were not recorded in marble inscriptions, yet they gave structure to every moment of the games. Without them, the amphitheatre would have been a place of confusion, not spectacle. They brought order, harmony, and continuity, weaving their quiet tasks into the fabric of Rome's grand illusions. At day's end, when the crowd had departed and silence once more settled over the empty tiers, these workers remained. Cleaners returned to sweep away husks of bread and pools of spilled wine. Stagehands lowered the lifts, locking the mechanisms into place. Musicians set aside their instruments, their horns dulled with breath and sweat. Vendors counted their coins by lamplight, their baskets empty now of cakes and nuts. The amphitheatre, so recently alive with thunder, returned again to its quieter rhythm. In the stillness of night, the great arena seemed almost to breathe. The sand, smoothed by rakes, glowed pale in the moonlight. The gates stood closed, their locks silent. Somewhere in the shadows, a solitary cleaner brushed the last scraps from the stone steps, the soft sound echoing faintly. It was in such moments that the truth of the amphitheatre revealed itself. Beneath the spectacle, beneath the noise, lay the unending work of hands unseen. These men and women were not remembered in poems or carved into triumphal arches. History does not preserve their names, yet they were the heartbeat of the games, the quiet rhythm beneath the roar. Without them, the amphitheatre could not function. They were Rome's silent orchestra, playing not with instruments of grandeur, but with brooms, baskets, ropes, and keys. And so, when we think of the gladiatorial games, let us also remember the whispers beneath the thunder, the rustle of straw, the scrape of rakes, the creak of wooden lifts, the soft call of a vendor offering bread. These were the sounds that gave life to the spectacle, the notes of an unseen symphony that carried on day after day until Rome itself began to fade.